Well, welcome everyone to Lecture 4 on Judges chapters 6 and 7, which starts off with Midian oppressing Israel. I'd like to start with a question. Do you know of people caught up in a particular problem where they seem to repeat it over and over and over again? Any people like that in here? Could be problems with the law, could be problems with alcohol and drugs, problems with family, problems in marriage. Well, Israel had its own repeat problem, and that problem was apostasy, kind of a $10 word there. It basically means they had turned their back on the Lord and worshiped false gods. Now, as we had in the lesson last week, Joshua, or maybe it was a couple weeks ago, Joshua had led a campaign of the Hebrews to conquer Canaan, but they didn't completely conquer the people that lived there. On the other hand, they lived with them, they exchanged their sons and daughters in marriage, and ultimately they ended up worshiping their gods. And God had warned them about this. He said, those people are going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to be a snare. But Israel decided to do things their own way. So they got into this cycle of servitude and deliverance. Israel would stray from the Lord. God would allow another nation to conquer them, to take them over. Israel would cry for deliverance, and God would send a deliverer. Now, who are these judges that we're reading about in the book of Judges? Well, you can think of them as a governor maybe, or a ruler, or maybe the best word is somebody who delivers. Remember, there weren't kings yet. There was no King Saul, King David yet, and so when the Lord would provide a judge, he was providing a deliverer. Some of the names: Ehud, Deborah, Samson, and in today's lesson, Gideon. Now, the Hebrews had been oppressed by the Midianites for 7 long years. And if you do a little research, you'll find that the Midianites were descendants from the line of Ishmael. Now, do you remember Ishmael? He was the son of Abraham, and not of Sarah, but of Sarah's handmaiden, Hagar. So this is almost like distant cousins, one group oppressing the other. And the Israelite people were very afraid of the Midianites. The Bible talks about the Midianites being like locusts. They would just come in and take everything that the Hebrews had worked for and gathered up and stored away. And they were so afraid they were living in the mountains. They were living in dens and caves. And I think one point to take away from this section is God uses tough times to get your attention. For today's lesson, those tough times were Midian. But I'm sure you know that that has happened to you or happened to someone you know, where God does use tough times to get your attention. Now, sometimes bad things just happen in our sinful world, but other times, tough times could be God tapping you on the shoulder saying, hey, it's time for you to return to me. So keep that in mind. Now, continuing on in chapter 6, verse 11 talks about the call of Gideon, and it mentions that the angel of the Lord came and sat down under a tree that was owned by Gideon's dad. And a lot of Lutheran Bible scholars believe that this phrase, the angel of the Lord, is referring to the pre-incarnate version of Jesus Christ. Sometimes when angels are in the Bible, they're delivering messages from God, relaying what's going to happen. But when you see the angel of the Lord and you hear that person talk, they start to take on attributes of God. He starts to speak as if he is God. And I encourage you, when you're reading the Old Testament, Genesis and Exodus and Judges especially, when you see that phrase, angel of the Lord, dig into it a little bit more and look at closely at the words that are being spoken. For example, earlier in Judges, chapter 2, verse 1, it mentions the angel of the Lord who says, I brought you up from Egypt. Now, who brought the Hebrews out of Egypt? Well, it was God, okay? In Genesis, when Abraham was directed to sacrifice his son Isaac, the angel of the Lord stops him and also mentions, by myself I have sworn. And there are other Bible references where God swears by himself because there is no higher authority he can verify or swear by than himself. And to throw out one more, the clearest one is Exodus, where Moses sees the burning bush, and the angel of the Lord says to him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that phrase, angel of the Lord, is a special one. Now, the angel of the Lord is there when Gideon is threshing wheat in the winepress. That's kind of a weird thing, isn't it? As I looked into it, I got the feeling that Gideon was hiding. I mean, we'd already talked about how they were afraid of the Midianites coming in and scooping up everything they had. And so he was threshing wheat in a place, trying to hide what he was doing so his family could, keep the wheat and not have it stolen from them. And the angel of the Lord tells Gideon at that time, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, I don't know, is that tongue-in-cheek a little bit? Is that God's humor? I don't know. Gideon certainly didn't feel like he was a mighty warrior. Matter of fact, he says, my clan is weak. I'm probably the weakest member of the clan. And by the way, a lot of people feel like the Lord has abandoned us. So one thing to take away from that is I think God sees more in people than people see in themselves a lot of times. God will use the weak. He'll use the foolish. He'll use the low and the meek to accomplish his purposes. And you see that throughout stories and events in the Bible. What about you? Can God use you? Yeah, he certainly can. We may not have a lot of faith in ourselves, but if God is with you, your cause is invincible. And in your prayer life, I'd encourage you to ask God to use you in whatever way he can to further his message in the world, to help your family, your community, this church. There's a lot of hidden talents out there, and God uses the humble and the weak to accomplish his purposes, just like he did with Gideon. Now, Gideon's still not too sure about this, so he asks for a sign from God. And in the meantime, Gideon prepares some meat and some bread to offer this angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord reaches out with his staff, and the tip of his staff touches the rock that the bread and the meat are on. Flame springs up, consumes it completely, and then he disappears. Now that would get your attention, right? We're talking miracles here in this section. That qualifies as one in my eyes. But Gideon's offer is accepted, but he's still afraid. He says, alas, I have seen the face of the angel of the Lord. But the Lord tells him, don't fear, you are not going to die. Because that was always a concern with a lot of folks and a lot of stories in the Bible. The angel of the Lord sometimes is associated with judgment and often death. A little later on in chapter 6, verse 28, God directs Gideon with a specific task. He tells him to tear down the Baal altar, to prepare a new altar, to tear down the Asherah wood pole that is next to the Baal, and to make an offering of not Gideon's bull, but the father's 7-year-old bull. Now, who's Baal? Baal is the supreme Canaanite god in the shape of a bull or a ram. And the Asherah was a Canaanite fertility goddess. Some people say that they thought that she was Baal's mother, but she was associated with a lot of sexual sin and problems that the Canaanites had, and the Israelites fell into that problem too. And it's kind of funny here. I don't know if the word is ironic or serendipitous, but the Midianites had oppressed Israel for 7 years, and this bull was a 7-year-old bull. So that's kind of interesting. And the Asherah, basically a pole made out of wood of this deity, Gideon was to chop it up and put the wood down and start a fire and sacrifice this bull. So one of the gods, the Asherah, is actually used by God to, accept an offering. And finally, Baal, like I mentioned, was often in the shape of a bull. And of course, a bull is used in this sacrifice. So that may be a little confusing, but there's a lot of things like that in the Bible where different themes and different stories and things in different books all weave together. And you can see pieces of it in different places. So that's another place to keep your eye out when you're doing your daily Bible readings. Now, Gideon did this, but he was still afraid. So he chose to follow God's order here on tearing down the Baal altar and that by doing it at night. And he was right to be afraid, because the next day when the people figured out Gideon did it, they wanted to kill him. I think the lesson that comes out of this particular section, for me anyway, is first set your own house in order before God can use you in a mighty way. With politicians, one of the chief sins is being a hypocrite, where they have all these public announcements and then you find out in private they've got all sorts of problems. I think this was God's way of having Gideon set things right in his own house with his father's altar and all that, clean all that away, and now I can use you more effectively in a more public way. So I think that's probably true in our lives too. It's hard to go out and pronounce things when you've got problems in your own life and people know it. So that seems to be a good lesson. Now Gideon seeks a second sign. And this one has to do with the overnight dew that was falling on the wool on the ground. If I've got the order correctly, I think the first time Gideon says, God, please, in the morning dew, let the wool fleece be wet and the ground around it dry. And that happened. God gave him that sign. As a matter of fact, there was enough water in the fleece to wring out a bowlful. So it was quite a bit there. And then Gideon says, don't be angry with me. Let me make one more request. Let the reverse happen on the second night. Let the wool be dry and the ground be wet. And God grants that second sign. God confirmed graciously his power to Gideon, and he was patient with him. Now, we had a little discussion in our small group, and I'm not a theologian or anything, but there's a lot of issues that could be discussed here. For example, one point in the New Testament, Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign. And I believe he was speaking that about the Pharisees. And I believe part of the reason he said that was because the Pharisees were asking for a sign in unbelief rather than belief. On the other hand, we also had the story in the lesson about the widow who was seeking justice from a judge because someone was oppressing her. And she asked again and again and again. And the judge finally, not out of a religious feeling or anything, but just because he was tired of being pestered, he said, all right, I'll grant you justice. Okay, so you've kind of got two different sides there. Another example, God says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench. So as we ask for things, Gideon asking for a first and then a second sign, trying to build up his faith, God will work with you on that. Philippians also says, in everything, let your requests be made known to God. So in my mind, kind of summarizing it, I would just encourage you in this area to ask for things in faith, trusting God. Ask for things in God's will, that the things you're asking for match up with what God has already revealed to you that he wants for you in your life. And ask for things in Jesus' name. So we're finally on to chapter 7 with Gideon's 300 men. The text says, the Spirit of the Lord was with Gideon, and he raised 32,000 men. But God saw the numbers, and he says, you know, the people who are with you are too many. If this victory comes about from having 32,000 men, the people will just rejoice in themselves. They'll boast in themselves. So God tells Gideon that whoever is fearful and trembling, let them return home. And 22,000 people, they're gone. So that left about 10,000. And when you read a little later in Judges, that was still about a 13-to-1 advantage for the Midianites. There were just hordes of Midianites. But God said the 10,000 is still too many, and that's when the water test comes in, where God tells Gideon to let the men go down to the water and drink water. And most of the men kneel down, and it sounds like they put their faces in the water and drink. But 300 men, instead of doing that, cup the water and bring the water to their mouth. And those 300 are the ones that God chooses. And I think this was just a way to get down to 300, to whittle it down from 32 to 10 to 300. I've also heard that, the ones that are cupping the water are a little more aware, a little more military men. I don't know. I don't think it was about military men for the victory here, do you? I think this was just a way of God showing that the victory was going to be his and not due to any military might of the people. And then God gives Gideon one more sign. And let me lead into this last sign in a particular way. Gideon didn't ask for it. God just offered it. But most everyone loves a scary story, except for my wife. She doesn't like scary stories. Creepy movies, spooky books, ghost stories around the campfire. If you get into those stories and you're really watching them and you're starting to get nervous, if somebody were to come up and tap you on the shoulder, you'd probably jump out of your skin, That's a real thing for people, and I think the Midianites were freaked out by Israel. They knew what God had done for them, bringing them out of Egypt. The plagues, the water turning into blood, the frogs, the boils, the death of the firstborn. Israel crossing the Red Sea on dry ground. They knew about the Egyptian army being wiped out. They knew about Joshua leading the Hebrews across the Jordan River on dry ground. And they also knew about the fall of Jericho and how Joshua, following God's direction, helped the walls fall down. So part of God's power in this case is, this may be a little bit of a strong word, but kind of this psychological terror was in the minds of the Midianites. They knew they were dealing with something out of this world, and they were afraid. So for this last sign, God encourages Gideon and the servant of his to go into the enemy camp and listen. And they're basically two men talking. One of them was telling about a dream that he had, and the other was interpreting it. And the man relays the dream, and he says, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell. And then the second man said, well, this is no other than a sign of the sword of Gideon, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. Okay. So the lesson to take away from this, I think, is success is determined by God's power, not by ours. Okay? As I mentioned before, if God is for you, no one can be against you. God's power is what determines the victory. And in this case, when Gideon heard that, he went back, and at night he took his 300 men, he split them into 3 groups of probably 100, and they surrounded the Midianites. Each man had a trumpet and a jar with a torch inside. And they surround the camp, and Gideon gives a signal, and they shout the phrase, "For the Lord and for Gideon," as loud as they could. They blow the trumpets, they smash the jars, the fire starts to spread, and God creates confusion in the ranks of the Midianites. And like I mentioned, they are already psychologically on edge. They wake up, they draw their swords, they get their spears, and before they know it, they're killing each other, not even the 300 men of Gideon. And when it's all done, 120,000 Midianites basically kill one another. Just a huge amount. I can't imagine the slaughter. 15,000 fled, but basically it was over. And that's how God achieved the victory. It also mentions 2 princes of Midian were executed after that. So that kind of, wraps up chapter 7. Just have a couple points I want to emphasize in conclusion that we've already talked about a little bit. Just remember, God uses tough times to get our attention. Tough times are always tough to go through, obviously, but consider that God may be trying to redirect what you're doing. God often uses common men and women to accomplish his will. He doesn't go out and necessarily have the kings and the eloquent speakers and the best personality on TV do things. It's often the common folk that he uses, and that probably includes all of us here. Private faithfulness before public usefulness is probably important, okay? Heard the phrase, you've got to clean up your own house first, and then you can do things for others. We'll always fall into sin. We'll always have to ask for forgiveness. We'll always have to repent and return to the Lord. But getting your own house in order is important, I think, in a faithful Christian life. 2 other points. God is patient with us in our faith life. We talked about some of this asking for signs or asking for things. If you have faith in God, God is patient with us and will help us, help our faith grow. And lastly, success is determined by God's power and not by ours. Well, that's it. I can be done being nervous now, right? Next week we continue in the book of Judges. I think the lesson is on Samson and Delilah. So God bless you in the rest of this week. Thank you.